Christmas window display murder. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries as intricate as the finest embroidery. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're bringing you a tale from the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most festive decorations can hide the darkest of secrets. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. Now, settle in as we follow the remarkable Miss Jane Marple through a case that proves Christmas cheer can sometimes mask the coldest of hearts. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Festive Attraction. December had arrived in St. Mary Mead with its customary charm, transforming the village into a scene worthy of a Christmas card. Frost gilded the hedgerows each morning, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from cottage chimneys. But the true centre of seasonal excitement stood on the high street, where Hartwell's department store had unveiled its annual Christmas window display. This year's creation surpassed all previous efforts. Miss Jane Marple paused during her morning constitutional to admire it alongside a small crowd of villagers. The window presented an elaborate Victorian Christmas scene, populated by mechanical figures that moved with remarkable realism. A family gathered around a dining table where the father carved a goose, while children played with wooden toys near a decorated tree. In the corner, carolers opened and closed their mouths in silent song, and a maid carried a plum pudding on a silver tray. The display had been the talk of the village for weeks. Thomas Reed, the window designer, had spent months perfecting the mechanisms, and the result was nothing short of magical. Children pressed their noses against the glass daily, watching the figures perform their endless Victorian Christmas. Miss Marple had to admit it possessed considerable charm, though she couldn't help but notice the enormous plate glass window was completely sealed, with heavy curtains visible behind the display to protect the delicate mechanisms from temperature changes and dust. Marcus Hartwell himself stood inside the store, visible through the main entrance, greeting customers with the satisfied smile of a man who knew his investment in spectacle had paid dividends. The store had never been busier, yet Miss Marple, with her characteristic attention to detail, observed something in the faces of the staff that troubled her. Dorothy Fletcher, the store manager who had served Hartwell's for 35 years, wore an expression of forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Young Sarah Mills, the maintenance technician, moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple had heard the rumours, of course. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, it was impossible to keep such news quiet for long. Marcus Hartwell had agreed to sell the store to Cromwell Retail Group, a large chain that planned to close the St. Mary Mead location immediately after Christmas. The building would be converted into one of their standardized shops, and all current staff would be made redundant. For 20 employees, many of whom had worked at Hartwell's for decades, the news meant unemployment beginning in the new year. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the store under the pretense of purchasing wool for a new knitting project. Dorothy Fletcher served her with professional courtesy, but Miss Marple noticed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the purchase. "They've worked here my entire adult life," Miss Fletcher said quietly, as if reading Miss Marple's thoughts. 35 years this coming February. I started as a shop girl when I was 23. Now I'm 58, and who's going to hire someone my age? The big chains want young people they can pay less. Miss Marple made sympathetic noises, but before she could respond, Thomas Reed emerged from the back room, his face flushed with anger. "He's refused again," Reed announced to no one in particular. "I offered to buy the store myself, to keep it running as an independent shop. I've got investors willing to back me, but Hartwell won't even consider it. He'll make $2 million from Cromwell, and that's all that matters to him." The bitterness in Reed's voice was palpable. Miss Marple knew he had designed the store's Christmas windows for 15 years, creating displays that had become something of a local tradition. Under Cromwell's ownership, such individual touches would be replaced with corporate-approved decorations, identical to every other shop in their chain. As Miss Marple left the store, she encountered Harold Price, whose security company monitored Hartwell's and several other businesses in the village. He stood on the pavement, staring up at the Christmas window with an expression of profound unhappiness. £40,000 a year, he muttered, seemingly to himself. 15 years of reliable service, and it means nothing. Cromwell has their own national security provider. My contract ends December the 31st. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, the cheerful lights of the Christmas window casting coloured shadows on the pavement. The display that brought such joy to the village's children had become a symbol of loss for those whose livelihoods depended on Hartwell's survival. She couldn't help but think of Sarah Mills, whose disabled son worked in the store's stockroom, a position specially adapted to accommodate his needs. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, she found her thoughts returning to the sealed window display and the mechanical figures performing their eternal Christmas celebration. There was something unsettling about the perfect Victorian scene, she reflected, something that spoke to the gap between festive appearance and harsh reality. The figures smiled and gestured in their glass prison, oblivious to the very real desperation of the people who maintained them. She had no premonition of tragedy, of course. How could she know that within 24 hours the Christmas window would become something far more sinister than a seasonal attraction? But Miss Marple had learned over her many years that human nature remained constant, regardless of the season, and that desperation could drive even the most ordinary people to extraordinary actions. Chapter 2. Death Behind Glass. Christmas Eve morning arrived with heavy frost transforming St. Mary Mead into a winter wonderland. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and had just finished her breakfast when she heard the siren of an ambulance racing through the village. Such sounds were unusual enough in their quiet community to merit investigation. She put on her coat and hat and made her way toward the high street, where a small crowd had already gathered outside Hartwell's department store. Police cars and an ambulance blocked the road, their lights painting the frost-covered pavement in shades of blue and red. Dorothy Fletcher stood on the pavement, wrapped in a coat pulled hastily over her work clothes, her face ashen. Beside her, Thomas Reed spoke urgently with a police constable gesturing toward the store's entrance. Miss Marple approached quietly, positioning herself where she could observe without being intrusive. "It's Mr. Hartwell," she heard someone whisper. "Found dead in the Christmas window this morning. Heart attack, they say. Terrible thing to happen on Christmas Eve." Miss Marple's interest sharpened immediately. She edged closer, arriving just as Dr. Haydock emerged from the store. The elderly physician looked troubled, his usual cheerful demeanour replaced by professional gravity. He spotted Miss Marple in the crowd and made his way toward her. "A bad business, Jane," he said quietly. "Marcus Hartwell is dead, found inside the window display about an hour ago." "Was it his heart?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Haydock glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "That's what it looks like initially, but I'm not satisfied. There's something not quite right about it. I've recommended a full post-mortem examination." Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Slack emerged from the store, his expression thunderous. Slack was a man who preferred simple cases with obvious solutions, and the scene before him clearly didn't meet that criteria. He spotted Dr. Haydock and strode over. "Well, Doctor, is it natural causes or isn't it? We need to know whether to treat this as a crime scene." "I can't give you a definitive answer yet, Inspector," Haydock replied, "but I can tell you that Mr. Hartwell shows signs of petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and face, consistent with oxygen deprivation. He didn't die of a heart attack. He suffocated." A murmur ran through the nearby crowd. Inspector Slack's face darkened. "Suffocated? How does a man suffocate in his own store? He must have gotten trapped. Somehow. Triggered some kind of accident. The window display is completely sealed, isn't it?" "Sealed to protect the mechanisms from weather," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "But that's precisely what troubles me. If it was an accident, how did it happen? And why didn't Mr. Hartwell simply exit through the access door?" Miss Marple absorbed this information with keen interest. She knew the window display well from her observations over the past weeks. The elaborate Victorian scene occupied a space perhaps 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, entirely enclosed by plate glass at the front and walls on the other 3 sides. The only access was through a locked door inside the store, leading to the display area. "Can you tell me exactly how Mr. Hartwell was found, Inspector Slack?" she asked politely. Slack, who had a complicated relationship with Miss Marple's involvement in police matters, nonetheless recognized her value in village investigations. He sighed. "He was discovered at 6:45 this morning by Dorothy Fletcher when she arrived to open the store. She could see him through the glass, slumped among the mechanical figures. He appears to have entered the display area around 6 a.m., according to our security footage. The cameras show him unlocking the access door and going inside, but no one else entered or left the area." "And the door was locked when Miss Fletcher found him?" Miss Marple inquired. Locked from the inside, Slack confirmed. We had to get the spare key from Fletcher to open it. By then, Hartwell had been dead for at least 30 minutes, possibly longer. Miss Marple considered this carefully. So Mr. Hartwell locked himself inside the display area and somehow suffocated there? Inspector Slack frowned. That's what it looks like. But as Dr. Haydock pointed out, there should have been no reason for him to suffocate. The display isn't airtight, or at least it shouldn't be. At that moment, Sarah Mills emerged from the store, her face tear-streaked. She spotted the gathering and hurried over. "I don't understand," she said to no one in particular. "The ventilation system was working perfectly yesterday. I checked it myself during the afternoon maintenance routine. Those mechanisms generate heat, you see. Without proper ventilation, they'd overheat and stop functioning." "Ventilation system," Dr. Haydock repeated sharply. "Was it working this morning?" Sarah Mills shook her head. "I just checked it at the inspector's request. The electrical supply has been cut, and all the air vents have been sealed with tape." From the inside. The implication hung in the air like the frost on the Christmas morning. Inspector Slack's expression shifted from irritation to grim determination. "Right," he said. "This is now officially a murder investigation. I want that entire display area treated as a crime scene. Nobody touches anything until forensics has been through it thoroughly." As the crowd dispersed, reluctantly accepting that the store would remain closed for Christmas Eve, Miss Marple stood contemplating the window display. Through the glass, she could see the mechanical Victorian family continuing their endless celebration, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The sealed window that had been designed to protect delicate mechanisms and create wonder for children had become a death chamber. Dr. Haydock joined her, following her gaze. "What are you thinking, Jane?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "I'm thinking about keys, Doctor. 5 people, according to Inspector Slack. 5 people with keys to access that display area. One of them is dead, which means one of the other 4 is a murderer. But how does someone commit murder in a sealed room without being seen entering or leaving?" Haydock asked. "That," Miss Marple replied, her eyes still fixed on the mechanical figures, "is precisely what we must discover. Though I suspect the answer lies not in what we can see, but in what we've been overlooking." Chapter 3. The Locked Room Puzzle. By midday on Christmas Eve, Inspector Slack had established a temporary command post in Hartwell's department store's administrative office. The building remained closed, its festive decorations now seeming grotesque in light of the morning's discovery. Miss Marple, who had been asked to provide a statement about her observations of the store in recent days, found herself in the unusual position of being present during the initial stages of the investigation. Inspector Slack, for all his bluster, had learned over the years that Miss Marple's insights often prove valuable, particularly in cases involving village residents and their complex relationships. The forensics team had completed their preliminary examination of the window display area. Their findings painted a disturbing picture. The ventilation system, which Sarah Mills had correctly identified as essential for the mechanical figure's operation, had indeed been deliberately disabled. The electrical supply wire had been cut with wire cutters, and every air vent in the display had been sealed from the inside with heavy-duty tape. The display space, approximately 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 10 feet high, had effectively become an airtight chamber. Marcus Hartwell's body had been found slumped against the back wall of the display, partially hidden behind a mechanical Christmas tree. Dr. Haydock's initial assessment had been confirmed by more detailed examination. Hartwell had died from suffocation, specifically from oxygen deprivation in the sealed environment. The process would have taken between 20 and 40 minutes, during which time Hartwell had apparently attempted to exit through the access door, only to find it locked. Scratch marks on the door's interior surface testified to his desperate final attempts to escape. "But here's what I don't understand," Inspector Slack said, reviewing the security footage with Miss Marple. "Present. The cameras cover every approach to the display area. Hartwell enters at precisely 6:03 a.m., using his key to unlock the access door. He goes inside, and the door closes behind him. Between then and 6:45, when Dorothy Fletcher discovered him, absolutely no one else approaches that door. No one enters, no one leaves. How does someone disable the ventilation system and seal the vents from inside without being visible on the cameras?" Miss Marple leaned forward to study the footage more carefully. The camera angle showed a corridor leading to the display access door, with clear views from both directions. The timestamp showed Hartwell entering, carrying what appeared to be a small toolbox. The door closed behind him, and then nothing. The corridor remained empty for the next 42 minutes until Dorothy Fletcher appeared, looking worried when she couldn't raise a response to her knocking. "Tell me about the display's construction," Miss Marple requested. "How exactly is it sealed?" Thomas Reed, who had been summoned to explain the technical details, stepped forward. His face still showed the shock of the morning's events, but his professional knowledge remained intact. "The front is plate glass, obviously," he explained. "The sides and back are solid walls, part of the building's structure. The top is a suspended ceiling sealed to prevent dust falling on the mechanisms. The floor is the original store floor, reinforced to support the weight of the mechanical figures. The only access is through that door, and there's no other way in or out," Inspector Slack pressed. Reed hesitated. "Well, there's the crawl space beneath the floor for accessing the mechanism drives and electrical systems. It connects to the basement maintenance tunnels that run throughout the building." "But those tunnels don't have camera coverage," Miss Marple inquired gently. Slack's expression darkened. "No, the cameras only cover public areas and main corridors." The maintenance tunnels were considered low priority for security monitoring. Sarah Mills, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "The crawl space access is through a panel in the floor of the display, hidden behind the mechanical dining table. It's how we service the drive mechanisms and wiring without having to dismantle the entire scene." "And who knows about this access point?" Miss Marple asked. Mills considered. "Everyone who works with the display. Mr. Reed designed it. I maintain it. Mr. Hartwell supervised its installation. Mr. Price's security company was informed about all access points when they designed our security system. Miss Fletcher knows because she has to coordinate maintenance schedules. The same 5 people with keys to the access door," Inspector Slack noted. "Reed, Mills, Price, Fletcher, and the deceased." He turned to the forensics technician who had examined the crawl space. "Did your team find anything down there?" "Evidence of recent access, sir," the technician replied. "Fresh. Scuff marks on the access panel, and fibers caught on the edges that we've sent for analysis. Also, the crawl space route leads directly to the ventilation system's electrical panel. Someone could have cut the power from down there, entered the display through the floor panel, sealed the vents with tape, then retreated the same way." While Hartwell was inside the display, Miss Marple said quietly, before he realized what was happening. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "That's the working theory. Our killer used the crawl space to access the display without being seen on cameras, disabled the ventilation, sealed the vents, and retreated before Hartwell could react. By the time Hartwell realized he was trapped, the killer was long gone and the door was locked from the outside." "But how did the killer lock the door from the outside if Hartwell had locked it from the inside?" Miss Marple asked. "That's another puzzle," Slack admitted. "The lock is a standard deadbolt, requiring a key from either side. Hartwell's key was found in his pocket. Each of the 4 other key holders confirmed they still have their keys in their possession this morning. So, we have 5 keys for 1 lock, and no evidence of any key being used to lock or unlock that door after Hartwell entered." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her mind working through the logistics. "Then how can you be certain the door was locked from the outside? Perhaps Mr. Hartwell locked it himself when he entered, as a matter of habit." "The scratches on the interior surface," Dr. Haydock interjected. "They're consistent with someone trying desperately to unlock a door, not lock it. Hartwell was trying to get out, not secure himself inside. The implications were clear and deeply troubling. Someone had deliberately created an airtight death chamber around Marcus Hartwell, using their knowledge of the building's hidden spaces to avoid detection. The Christmas window display, designed to bring joy and wonder, had been transformed into an instrument of murder. Miss Marple gazed at the mechanical Victorian figures, still performing their cheerful pantomime through the sealed glass. Somewhere in the relationships between Hartwell and his 4 employees lay the motive for this carefully planned killing, and somewhere in the physical evidence lay the proof of how it had been accomplished. She had no doubt Inspector Slack would find both eventually. The question was whether she might find them first. Chapter 4. The Desperate 4. The afternoon of Christmas Eve found Miss Marple at the vicarage, where the rector's wife had organised an impromptu gathering to discuss the tragedy at Hartwell's department store. The village was still reeling from the news that Marcus Hartwell had been murdered, and the closure of the store on the busiest shopping day of the year had left many residents without their final Christmas purchases. But Miss Marple's interest in attending had little to do with festive preparations and everything to do with information gathering. Dorothy Fletcher sat in the corner of the vicarage drawing room, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. The store manager looked as though she had aged 10 years in a single morning. Miss Marple took a seat nearby, offering quiet sympathy. "It must be a terrible shock, Miss Fletcher," she said gently, "to discover Mr. Hartwell that way." Dorothy Fletcher nodded mechanically. "I thought he'd had a heart attack at first," she whispered. Through the glass, he just looked like he was resting. It wasn't until I unlocked the door and went inside that I realized something was terribly wrong. The smell, you see, the air inside was so stale. "And you arrived at your usual time?" Miss Marple inquired. 6:45. I always open the store at 7, so I arrive 15 minutes early to prepare the registers and check everything is secure. Mr. Hartwell often came in earlier to work on paperwork or make adjustments to displays. He was very particular about the Christmas window this year. He wanted it to be perfect for when the Cromwell people came for their final inspection. Miss Marple filed this information away. Cromwell Retail Group was sending representatives. "Oh yes," Dorothy confirmed. They were scheduled to visit on the 27th for a final walkthrough before the sale completed. Mr. Hartwell wanted everything pristine. That's why he was in the display area so early yesterday morning. He was making final adjustments to the mechanical figures. Thomas Reed joined them, overhearing the last comment. "Adjustments that weren't necessary," he said bitterly. "The mechanisms were working perfectly. I'd tested everything the night before. But Marcus never trusted anyone else's work. He had to tinker with things himself." Reed settled heavily into a chair, his designer's hands restless on his knees. "I still can't believe someone would kill him. I mean, I hated what he was doing to the store, to all of us. But murder? That's something else entirely." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "I understand you offered to purchase the store yourself, Mr. Reed." He laughed without humour, for all the good it did. "I had investors ready, a solid business plan. We could have kept Hartwell's running as an independent store, maintained all the staff positions, but Marcus wouldn't even look at my proposal. He said Cromwell's offer was £2 million, and nothing I could arrange would match that. He was right, of course, but it wasn't just about the money, not for me. This store is part of the village's heritage." The pain in Reed's voice was genuine. Miss Marple knew he had designed the Christmas windows for 15 years, each one more elaborate than the last. Under Cromwell's ownership, such individual creativity would be replaced with corporate uniformity. For a man whose artistic identity was tied to those displays, the loss would be profound. Harold Price arrived at the vicarage shortly after, looking as though he hadn't slept. The security company owner accepted a cup of tea but remained standing, too agitated to sit. "They're reviewing all my security footage," he announced to the room, "going back weeks, looking for anything suspicious. As if I haven't run a reputable company for 15 years without incident." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "The security arrangements must have been quite comprehensive, Mr. Price. We had cameras covering every entrance and main corridor," Price said. "Fire alarms, motion sensors in the stockrooms, the works. But the maintenance tunnels," he shook his head. "Marcus refused to extend camera coverage down there. Said it was an unnecessary expense since only staff accessed those areas. Now look what's happened." "You can't blame yourself," Dorothy Fletcher said quietly. "How could any of us have anticipated this?" Price turned to her, his expression anguished. "My contract with Hartwell's is worth £40,000 annually. Cromwell has already informed me they'll be using their national provider from January 1st. £40,000 gone. I've got 6 employees depending on those wages. What am I supposed to tell them after Christmas?" The room fell silent. Miss Marple understood that each person present faced similar losses. Dorothy Fletcher, at 58, would struggle to find comparable employment. Thomas Reed would lose not just income but his creative outlet and professional reputation. And then there was Sarah Mills, who had yet to arrive at the gathering. "I understand Sarah has a son who works at the store," Miss Marple ventured. Dorothy Fletcher's expression softened. "Yes, Michael. He's 23, has developmental disabilities. Marcus created a special position for him in the stockroom, adapted the duties to match Michael's capabilities. It was one of the few genuinely kind things Marcus ever did. Sarah is devoted to that boy. The thought of him losing his job, his purpose, she trailed off. At that moment, Sarah Mills herself entered the vicarage, apologizing for her lateness. The young technician looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes testifying to a sleepless night. Miss Marple noted that Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of tea. "I've just come from another round of questioning with Inspector Slack," Sarah said quietly. "They found fibres from my maintenance uniform in the crawl space beneath the display floor." "Of course they did. I work down there almost every week, servicing the mechanisms." "But they're treating it like evidence of guilt." Thomas Reed looked alarmed. "Surely they don't suspect you?" "We're all suspects, Mr. Reed," Sarah replied with a bitter smile. "We all had keys to the display access. We all knew about the crawl space and ventilation system. And we all had reasons to hate what Marcus Hartwell was doing to this store and to our lives." The stark truth of her words hung in the air. Miss Marple observed each face carefully, noting the various expressions of fear, anger, and despair. These were desperate people facing desperate circumstances. Any one of them might have been driven to murder. But, as Miss Marple knew from long experience, opportunity and motive, while necessary, were not sufficient to identify a killer. What mattered was method, the specific knowledge and capability to execute this particular crime. And as she listened to the four suspects discuss their relationships with the deceased and with the store, she began to form a theory about which of them possessed that crucial combination of knowledge, opportunity, and desperation sufficient to transform a Christmas display into a death chamber. Chapter 5. The Mechanical Alibi. On Christmas morning, while most of St. Mary Mead attended church services, Miss Marple made her way to Hartwell's department store. Inspector Slack had granted her request to examine the crime scene more thoroughly, recognizing that her insights might prove valuable. The store stood silent and dark, its festive decorations seeming forlorn without the usual bustle of customers. The Christmas window display continued its mechanical performance, the Victorian figures acting out their celebration for an audience of empty streets. Inspector Slack met her at the entrance, looking haggard from a night spent reviewing evidence and conducting interviews. "We've had the forensics report on those fibres from the crawl space," he announced. "They match Sarah Mills' maintenance uniform exactly." Combined with her knowledge of the building's systems and her access to the basement tunnels, she's our primary suspect. "But you're not satisfied," Miss Marple observed. "It's not a question." Slack sighed. "The timeline troubles me. According to Dorothy Fletcher's statement, Sarah Mills was visible in the main store from 5:50 until 6:30 yesterday morning, helping to prepare a delivery that arrived early. Multiple witnesses confirm seeing her during that period. She couldn't have been in the crawl space disabling the ventilation system while simultaneously sorting deliveries in full view of other staff. "Unless she prepared everything beforehand," Miss Marple suggested. "Could the ventilation have been disabled earlier, perhaps the previous evening?" "The forensics team considered that," Slack replied. "But the electrical cut is clean and fresh, done within hours of Hartwell's death. Moreover, the mechanisms were functioning normally until Wednesday night." Thomas Reed confirmed he tested everything at 9 p.m, and the mechanical figures require ventilation to prevent overheating. If the system had been disabled Wednesday evening, the figures would have stopped working, and Hartwell would have noticed when he arrived Thursday morning. They entered the store, walking through the dimly lit aisles toward the display area. Miss Marple paused to examine the access door, noting the deep scratches on its interior surface where Hartwell had desperately tried to escape. The door itself was solid wood with a robust deadbolt lock requiring a key from either side. "Show me the crawl space access," she requested. Slack led her into the display area, now unsealed and accessible for investigation purposes. The Victorian scene looked strange from this perspective, the mechanical figures looming larger than life, their painted faces frozen in expressions of joy that now seemed grotesque. Behind the dining table, a section of floor had been removed by the forensics team, revealing the crawl space beneath. "It's about 3 feet high," Slack explained. "Runs the length of the display and connects to the main basement maintenance tunnels. Those tunnels extend throughout the building, providing access to plumbing, electrical systems, and the heating plant. Anyone entering through the basement could reach this crawl space without being seen on security cameras." Miss Marple peered into the opening, noting the mechanical drives and electrical wiring that powered the animated figures above. She could see the ventilation system's electrical panel, located along the wall of the crawl space, with the severed wire clearly visible. "The tape used to seal the air vents," she asked. What type was it? Heavy-duty duct tape, Slack replied. The kind used in building maintenance. Sarah Mills has access to supplies like that, of course. But so do any number of people. We found partial fingerprints on some of the tape strips, but they're smudged and likely useless for identification. Miss Marple straightened, brushing dust from her coat. She turned her attention to the ventilation vents themselves, positioned high on the walls of the display area. There were 4 of them, each about 6 inches square, normally covered with decorative grilles that matched the Victorian aesthetic of the scene. To seal all 4 vents with tape, one would need to reach them, she observed. That would require a ladder, wouldn't it? Or standing on something. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. We found a stepladder stored in the corner of the display area, behind the mechanical Christmas tree. Hartwell regularly used it for adjustments to the upper mechanisms. The killer could have used it to reach the vents, then returned it to its storage position. Miss Marple walked slowly around the display area, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She paused at each vent, examining the tape placement carefully. The work had been done thoroughly and efficiently, each vent sealed with multiple overlapping strips to ensure no air could pass through. This would have taken several minutes, she said thoughtfully. Even working quickly, one would need at least 10 or 15 minutes to cut the electrical supply, climb up to seal each vent properly, and retreat through the crawl space. And during that time, Mr. Hartwell was inside this space? He must have been, Slack confirmed. According to the security footage, he entered at 6:03 and never left, so either he was already dead when the killer did this work, or he was somehow incapacitated and unable to prevent it. Dr. Haydock's report found no signs of violence or drugging, Miss Marple recalled. Mr. Hartwell died from oxygen deprivation, nothing else. Which brings us back to the timeline problem, Slack said. If Sarah Mills couldn't have done this work between 5:50 and 6:30 because she was visible in the main store, and if Hartwell was inside the display from 6:03 onward, then when was the ventilation system disabled? Unless, Miss Marple said slowly, her eyes focusing on the mechanical figures, unless Mr. Hartwell was already dead when he entered the display area at 6:03. Slack stared at her. But the security footage clearly shows Hartwell walking into the display. We identified him by his clothing and build. Miss Marple moved closer to one of the mechanical figures, examining its construction carefully. These figures are quite sophisticated, aren't they? They move in specific patterns, programmed sequences that repeat continuously, and they're approximately the same size as an adult human. Where are you going with this? Slack asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. Miss Marple turned to face him, her expression grave. I'm suggesting, Inspector, that we may have been deceived by what appeared to be Marcus Hartwell entering the display area on Christmas Eve morning. What if the figure captured on that security footage was not Hartwell at all, but rather one of these mechanical figures, dressed in his clothing and moved into position to create a false timeline? The implications were staggering. If Miss Marple was correct, then Hartwell had died earlier, before 6 a.m., and the killer had staged an elaborate mechanical deception to establish a false timeline and obscure the true moment of death. Inspector Slack's face hardened with determination. We need to review that security footage again, frame by frame, and I want the medical examiner to reassess the time of death with this new theory in mind. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you'll find, Inspector, that the person who committed this murder possessed not only knowledge of the store's hidden passages and ventilation systems, but also intimate familiarity with the mechanical figures and how they operate. Someone who could program them to perform a specific action, someone who could make a mechanical figure appear, briefly, to be a living man. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Son. By Boxing Day, the investigation had taken on new urgency. Dr. Haydock's revised examination of Marcus Hartwell's body, conducted with the possibility of an earlier time of death in mind, revealed evidence that supported Miss Marple's theory. The degree out of Reichert mortis and other post-mortem changes suggested Hartwell had died closer to 5 a.m. than 6 a.m., meaning the figure seen entering the display area on security footage could not have been the living man. Inspector Slack ordered a frame-by-frame analysis of the recording. What emerged was remarkable and damning. The figure that appeared to be Marcus Hartwell entering the display moved with an odd stiffness, its gait mechanical and its arm positions unnaturally rigid. When slowed down and enhanced, the footage revealed that what appeared to be Hartwell's face was actually a crude mask or covering, sufficient to deceive a casual observer or a low-resolution security camera, but clearly artificial under scrutiny. Someone had programmed one of the mechanical figures to move from inside the display area, through the access door, and into view of the security camera, creating the illusion of Hartwell entering at 6:03 a.m. The real Hartwell had been dead for over an hour by that point, killed elsewhere, and his body positioned in the display afterward. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, reviewing what she knew about the four suspects: Dorothy Fletcher, Thomas Reed, Harold Price, and Sarah Mills. Each had motive, each had opportunity, and each had knowledge of the store's layout, but only one of them possessed the specific technical expertise to program mechanical figures and create such an elaborate deception. Thomas Reed, the window designer. Yet something troubled Miss Marple about this conclusion. Reed's movements on Christmas Eve morning had been accounted for. He had been at home until 7 a.m. when he arrived at the store in response to Dorothy Fletcher's frantic telephone call about Hartwell's death. Multiple neighbours confirmed seeing lights in Reed's workshop throughout the early morning hours. Unless Reed had an accomplice, he couldn't have been at the store to kill Hartwell at 5 a.m. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Sarah Mills and her son Michael. She had seen the young man around the village occasionally, a quiet presence who performed his stockroom duties with careful concentration. Michael had worked at Hartwell's for 3 years, ever since Sarah had persuaded Marcus Hartwell to create a position adapted to his capabilities. On an impulse, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Slack. "I wonder if I might speak with Sarah Mills and her son," she said. "I believe there may be something we've overlooked." Slack, who had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts, arranged for them to visit Sarah Mills's cottage the following morning. The Mills home was a modest terraced house on the edge of the village, kept with meticulous care. Sarah answered the door with obvious trepidation, her face pale with worry. Michael sat in the front room, working on an intricate jigsaw puzzle spread across a large table. He was a young man of 23, with his mother's dark hair and gentle eyes that seemed to focus intently on the puzzle pieces before him. "Miss Marple?" "Inspector Slack," Sarah said nervously. "Please, come in. I don't know what more I can tell you. I've answered all your questions truthfully." Miss Marple settled into a chair near Michael, observing the young man as he carefully fitted pieces together. Worked with remarkable precision, his movements deliberate and methodical. The puzzle depicted a winter scene, not unlike the Christmas window display at Hartwell's. "Michael," Miss Marple said gently, "do you enjoy working at the store?" Michael didn't look up from his puzzle, but he nodded. "I organise the stockroom," he said in a quiet, careful voice. "Everything has its place. I make sure items are sorted by size and category. Mr. Hartwell said I was very good at organising." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He loved that job," she whispered. "It gave him purpose, structure." Without it, she broke off, unable to continue. Miss Marple watched Michael for a moment longer, noting how his hands moved with practiced efficiency. "Tell me, Michael, do you ever help your mother with her maintenance work at the store?" "Sometimes," Sarah interjected quickly, "but only during evening hours when the store is closed. He helps me check the mechanical figures, make sure all the gears and drives are functioning properly." Michael is actually quite skilled with mechanical systems. He has an instinctive understanding of how things work together. Michael looked up for the first time, meeting Miss Marple's gaze briefly before returning to his puzzle. "I like the mechanical people," he said. "They do the same things every time. No surprises, the pattern is always the same." Miss Marple felt a chill run through her. "Inspector Slack, I think we need to examine the basement maintenance tunnels more carefully," she said quietly. "Particularly the route from the Mills home to the store." Sarah Mills had gone very still, her face ashen. "There is a route, isn't there?" Miss Marple continued gently. "Not through the village streets, but through the old service tunnels that connect several of these terraced houses to the commercial buildings on the high street, left over from the Victorian era when servants needed discreet access to shops and businesses." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. "Those tunnels haven't been used in decades," she whispered. "They're dangerous, unstable." "But you knew about them," Miss Marple said, "because part of your maintenance duties involved checking the structural integrity of the basement areas. And you knew that one of those tunnels, though officially sealed, could still be accessed from your own cellar." The room fell silent except for the soft sound of Michael fitting puzzle pieces together. Inspector Slack stood, his expression grave. "Miss Mills, I think you need to tell us what happened on Christmas Eve morning. Sarah Mills began to weep quietly, her shoulders shaking. Michael continued with his puzzle, seemingly unaware of the tension in the room. After a long moment, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. He was going to take everything away from Michael, she said. The job, the routine, the purpose. Do you know what that would have done to my son? Michael needs structure, predictability. That job at Hartwell's gave him both. It gave him dignity. Chapter 7. The Mother's Confession. Sarah Mills sat very still in her front room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as Inspector Slack prepared to take her formal statement. Michael continued working on his jigsaw puzzle, his concentration unbroken by the drama unfolding around him. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe both mother and son, her expression compassionate but unwavering. "Tell us what happened," Inspector Slack said quietly. "From the beginning." Sarah drew a shaky breath. "It started 3 weeks ago when Mr. Hartwell announced the sale to Cromwell Retail. He gathered all the staff and told us, just like that we'd all be redundant after Christmas. 20 people losing their jobs, and he didn't even seem to care. All he could talk about was his £2 million and his plans to retire to Spain." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I went to him privately, begged him to reconsider. I explained about Michael, about how much the job meant to him, about how impossible it would be to find another position that accommodated his needs. Do you know what he said? He said that business was business, and that I was being emotional and irrational." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "That must have been very painful to hear." "It was more than painful," Sarah replied, her voice hardening. "It was cruel. Michael had finally found a place where he belonged, where he could contribute and feel valued, and Hartwell was taking that away for nothing more than money he didn't even need. The man was already wealthy. This sale was pure greed." "When did you begin planning?" Inspector Slack asked. "I didn't plan it. Not really," Sarah said. "Or at least, I didn't think of it as planning. I just kept thinking about the store's layout, about the systems I maintained, about the Christmas window display. I knew every inch of that building, every hidden space, every access point, and I knew about the old service tunnels because I'd discovered them during a maintenance inspection last year." She glanced at Michael, who had completed a section of his puzzle and was studying the remaining pieces with intense focus. "I knew I couldn't let Michael lose his job. I knew what it would do to him. He'd retreat into himself, stop communicating, stop engaging with the world. I've seen it happen before when his routine is disrupted. I couldn't let Hartwell destroy my son's life." "Walk us through Christmas Eve morning," Slack instructed. Sarah nodded slowly. "I accessed the service tunnel from our cellar at 4:30 a.m. Michael was asleep. The tunnel runs directly beneath the high street and connects to the basement of Hartwell's. I'd cleared the old tunnel entrance weeks earlier during my regular maintenance duties, made it look like routine work. No one questioned why I was spending time in the basement." She continued, her voice taking on a mechanical quality, as if she were describing someone else's actions. "I entered the store's basement at approximately 4:45. I knew Hartwell would arrive early on Christmas Eve. He always did when something important was happening, and the Cromwell inspection was scheduled for the 27th. He was obsessive about the Christmas display being perfect. I heard him enter the building at 5 a.m. He went straight to the display area, as I knew he would." She paused, her face contorted with the memory. "I was already in position in the crawl space beneath the display floor. I could hear him moving above me, adjusting the mechanical figures, checking their movements. I waited until he moved to the far corner, near the Christmas tree, where the stepladder was stored." "Then what happened?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I had brought wire cutters and tape with me. I cut the electrical supply to the ventilation system first. The sound was covered by the noise of the mechanical figures operating. Then I removed the floor access panel, very quietly, and climbed up into the display area." Inspector Slack's expression was grim. "Did Hartwell see you?" "He turned when he heard me," Sarah said. "He looked surprised, then angry. He demanded to know what I was doing in the display area. I didn't say anything. I just took the stepladder and began sealing the ventilation vents with tape. He realized what I was doing after I sealed the second vent. He tried to stop me, came toward me, but I'd positioned the stepladder to block his path." "Was there a struggle?" Slack asked. "No," Sarah replied. "He couldn't reach me while I was up the ladder, and by the time I'd finished the third vent, he was already having difficulty breathing. The space wasn't large, and with the ventilation disabled and 3 of 4 vents sealed, the oxygen level was dropping rapidly. I sealed the 4th vent while he slumped against the wall, gasping. Miss Marple's eyes were sad, but her voice remained steady. "And then you left through the crawl space, taking the stepladder with you, and sealed the floor panel behind you." "Yes," Sarah confirmed. I returned to the basement tunnel and went home. The entire thing took less than 30 minutes. Michael was still asleep when I returned. "But the security footage," Inspector Slack interjected. "The figure that appeared to enter the display at 6:03. Sarah almost smiled, though there was no humour in the expression. That was the clever part, I thought. I'd spent weeks studying Thomas Reed's programming system for the mechanical figures. During my evening maintenance work, when no one else was in the store, I learned how to adjust their movements and timing sequences. Before I left through the crawl space, I programmed one of the figures, the father figure from the dining table scene, to perform a specific action at 6:03 a.m. She explained the technical details with a maintenance technician's precision. I removed some of the figure's Victorian costume pieces and used items from Hartwell's toolbox that he'd left in the display to create the appearance of his clothing and build. Added a simple mask over the figure's face, just enough to suggest Hartwell's features from a distance. Then I programmed it to move from inside the display, through the access door, into camera view and back again. The door was already locked from the outside. I'd taken Hartwell's key after he died and locked it myself before descending into the crawl space. The mechanical figure just had to create the illusion that Hartwell was still alive at 6:03. Inspector Slack shook his head. It was an extraordinarily complex plan. "Not really," Sarah said. "I work with those mechanical systems every day. Once you understand how they operate, programming them to perform specific movements is straightforward. And I had one advantage. I knew Hartwell would be alone that early, and I knew no one would discover him until Dorothy Fletcher arrived at 6:45. By then, he'd been dead for over an hour, and I'd been visible in the main store, helping with deliveries, establishing my alibi." "But you made mistakes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your uniform fibres in the crawl space were one. The tape on the ventilation panel where you cut the electrical supply bore traces of your fingerprints, despite your attempts to smudge them. And most tellingly, your intimate knowledge of mechanical programming was something only someone with months of detailed study could possess. Thomas Reed knows his own systems. Once we asked him specifically about unauthorized access to his programming equipment, he remembered finding settings adjusted, timing sequences altered slightly. He'd assumed he'd made the changes himself during routine maintenance and forgotten about them. But they were your work, weren't they? Your practice runs for Christmas Eve morning." Sarah Mills nodded, her face crumbling. "I thought I'd been so careful," she whispered. "I thought I'd covered everything." "But you can't cover everything," Miss Marple said gently. "Human nature always reveals itself eventually." Inspector Slack stood, preparing to formally arrest Sarah Mills. Miss Marple rose as well, pausing beside Michael, who had nearly completed his jigsaw puzzle. The young man looked up at her, his expression serene and focused. "It's almost finished," he said, indicating the puzzle. "Everything in its proper place." Miss Marple felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, Michael," she said softly. "Everything in its proper place." As Inspector Slack led Sarah Mills from her home, the young woman turned back once to look at her son. Michael had already returned his attention to the final pieces of his puzzle, unaware that his mother's attempt to preserve his world had destroyed it utterly. Chapter 8. The Web of Consequences. The days following Sarah Mills's arrest brought a strange quiet to St. Mary Mead. The Christmas season, usually filled with joy and celebration, was overshadowed by the tragedy at Hartwell's department store and the revelation that a desperate mother had committed murder to protect her son's livelihood. Miss Marple spent much of that time in contemplation, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she considered the tangled web of consequences that had led to Marcus Hartwell's death. Inspector Slack called on her 3 days after Sarah's confession, looking worn but satisfied that the case had been resolved. He found Miss Marple in her sitting room, a fire crackling in the grate against the winter cold. "The Crown Prosecution Service is proceeding with charges of murder," he informed her. "Sarah Mills will stand trial, likely in the spring. Her solicitor is planning to argue diminished responsibility, claiming she acted under extreme emotional distress due to her son's circumstances." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Michael? What will become of him?" That's the tragic part, Slack replied. He's been placed temporarily with Sarah's sister in Brighton, but the woman has 3 children of her own and limited resources. Michael is struggling with the disruption to his routine, as his mother predicted he would. Social services are working to find appropriate support, but positions like the one at Hartwell's, specifically adapted for individuals with his needs, are rare. So Sarah's attempt to protect her son has resulted in exactly what she feared most, Miss Marple observed quietly. He's lost his job, his routine, his sense of purpose, and now his mother as well. The irony is particularly cruel. Slack settled into a chair, accepting the tea Miss Marple offered. I've been thinking about motive, he said. Sarah Mills had the strongest personal reason to want Hartwell dead. The loss of Michael's job would have devastating consequences for her son. But the other 3 suspects, Fletcher, Reed, and Price, they all faced serious hardships as well. Any of them might have been driven to murder under different circumstances. That's what troubles me most about this case, Miss Marple replied. The true villain, in many ways, was not Sarah Mills, but Marcus Hartwell himself. His decision to sell the store to Cromwell Retail, driven purely by profit with no consideration for the 20 employees whose lives would be destroyed, created the conditions for tragedy. She paused, her needles stilling. I spoke with Dorothy Fletcher yesterday. The poor woman is facing unemployment at 58 with virtually no savings, her entire adult life invested in Hartwell's, and she'll receive minimal redundancy payment because the store is being sold rather than closed. Thomas Reed has lost not only his income, but his artistic legacy. 15 years of creating Christmas magic for the village ended because corporate efficiency doesn't value individual creativity. And Harold Price, Slack added, his security company has lost its largest contract. He's had to let 4 of his 6 employees go already. The ripple effects of Hartwell's decision extend far beyond the store itself. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression troubled. What strikes me as particularly significant is how Sarah Mills transformed the Christmas window display itself, the very symbol of joy and community celebration, into an instrument of death. The mechanical figures that brought wonder to children became tools of deception. The sealed environment that protected delicate mechanisms became a suffocation chamber. She used Hartwell's own obsession with perfection against him. Slack was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. Do you think she's sorry? For killing him, I mean? I think she's sorry for the consequences, Miss Marple replied. Sorry that her plan failed to achieve what she hoped, that Michael lost everything anyway. But sorry for Hartwell's death? I'm not certain. In her mind, she was protecting her child from a cruel man who cared only for money. Parents will go to extraordinary lengths for their children, even when those lengths lead to tragedy. The inspector rose to leave, but paused at the door. There's one thing I still don't fully understand. How did you know to look at the security footage so carefully? What made you suspect the figure entering the display wasn't actually Hartwell? Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was something Michael said when we visited their home. He talked about how he liked the mechanical people because they did the same things every time. No surprises, the pattern always the same. It made me think about patterns and repetition, and how someone intimately familiar with mechanical patterns might use them to deceive. When I looked at that footage again with that thought in mind, I noticed the figure's movements were too regular, too precise. Real humans don't move with such mechanical consistency. Slack shook his head in admiration. You have a remarkable mind, Miss Marple. After he left, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. The case troubled her deeply, more than most investigations. Sarah Mills was not an inherently evil person. She was a devoted mother, pushed to desperate measures by circumstances created by another's greed. Yet murder remained murder, regardless of motive or justification. The law would take its course, and Sarah would pay the price for her actions. But who would hold Marcus Hartwell accountable for his role in creating the desperation that led to his own death? The next day, Miss Marple learned that Cromwell Retail Group had decided not to proceed with the purchase of Hartwell's department store. The murder and attendant publicity had made the property undesirable, associated now with tragedy rather than tradition. The store would be sold at auction instead, its future uncertain. Thomas Reed immediately began organising a consortium to bid on the property, hoping to keep Hartwell's operating as an independent store. Dorothy Fletcher, despite her financial anxiety, threw herself into supporting his efforts. Even Harold Price contributed what resources he could spare. The village rallied behind the initiative, recognizing that they had nearly lost something precious. But this positive outcome, if it came to pass, would be cold comfort to Sarah Mills, facing trial for murder, or to Michael, struggling to adapt to a disrupted life far from the routine that had given him stability. Miss Marple reflected that in trying to preserve one small part of the world for her son, Sarah had instead torn that world apart completely. The Christmas window display remained dark and empty, the mechanical figures frozen in their perpetual celebration. The Victorian scene that should have represented tradition, family and community had become a memorial to what happened when economic desperation met parental devotion, when corporate greed pushed ordinary people past the limits of endurance. Miss Marple understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the threads connecting human beings were fragile things, easily tangled, easily broken, and once broken, they were extraordinarily difficult to mend. Chapter 9. The Courtroom Revelation. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with its customary beauty, bringing apple blossoms to the orchards and daffodils to cottage gardens. But the village remained subdued, still processing the events of the previous Christmas. The trial of Sarah Mills, scheduled for late April, dominated local conversation. Miss Marple had been called as a witness for the prosecution, given her role in identifying the mechanical deception that had initially obscured the timeline of Marcus Hartwell's death. The courtroom in the county town was packed with spectators, many from St. Mary Mead itself. Sarah Mills sat in the dock looking small and defeated, her sister seated in the public gallery with Michael beside her. The young man seemed uncomfortable in the formal setting, his hands moving restlessly as he tried to cope with the unfamiliar environment. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the physical evidence: Sarah's fingerprints on the ventilation panel, fibers from her uniform in the crawl space, her intimate knowledge of the store's hidden passages and mechanical systems. They established motive through testimony about Marcus Hartwell's decision to sell the store and the devastating impact on Michael's specially adapted employment. Inspector Slack testified about Sarah's confession, delivered with remarkable detail and technical precision. When Miss Marple took the stand, she described her observations with characteristic clarity, explaining how she had recognized the mechanical nature of the figure in the security footage and traced the method of deception back to someone with maintenance knowledge and access to Thomas Reed's programming systems. The prosecution emphasized the premeditation involved, the weeks of preparation, the deliberate study of mechanical programming, the clearing of the service tunnel, the timing of the attack. But it was the defense's presentation that truly captured the courtroom's attention. Sarah Mills's barrister, a sharp woman named Patricia Thornton, built her case not around denial of the facts, but around the context that had driven her client to murder. She called Dorothy Fletcher to testify about the conditions at Hartwell's department store, the low wages, the lack of job security, the owner's indifference to employee welfare. Thomas Reed described Hartwell's refusal to consider alternative buyers, his focus solely on maximizing personal profit regardless of community impact. Harold Price testified about the broader economic consequences of the store's sale, the lost contracts and eliminated positions rippling through the village economy. Then Thornton called medical experts who testified about the challenges faced by families caring for adult children with developmental disabilities, the scarcity of appropriate employment opportunities, the critical importance of routine and structure for individuals like Michael Mills. A psychologist explained how the loss of meaningful employment could trigger severe depression and behavioral regression in people with Michael's condition. Michael himself was called to testify, though Thornton handled him with extraordinary gentleness. "Can you tell the court about your job at Hartwell's?" she asked. Michael spoke quietly, his eyes fixed on a point above the judge's head. "I organized the stockroom. Everything had its place. Sizes together, categories together. I was good at organizing. Mr. Hartwell said so." "And how did you feel when you learned the store was being sold?" Michael's expression crumpled slightly. "My mum said I wouldn't have my job anymore. No more organizing, no more store. She said it would be all right, but I knew it wouldn't be. Without the job, I don't know what I'm supposed to do." The courtroom was silent as Michael stepped down, his confusion and distress palpable. Miss Marple, watching from the public gallery, felt her heart ache for the young man caught in circumstances beyond his comprehension. Finally, Sarah Mills herself took the stand. Thornton's questioning was direct and emotional. "Why did you kill Marcus Hartwell?" Sarah's voice was steady despite the tears on her face. "Because he was going to destroy my son's life." Michael had finally found a place where he belonged, where he could contribute and feel valued. Hartwell was taking that away, not out of necessity, but out of greed. He didn't need the money from the sale. He was already wealthy. This was about padding his retirement fund at the expense of 20 people's livelihoods, including my son's sense of purpose and dignity. "Did you consider other options?" Thornton asked. "Every day for 3 weeks," Sarah replied. "I begged Hartwell to reconsider. I offered to take a pay cut if it would help keep the store independent. I researched other potential buyers, other business models. Nothing mattered to him except the £2 million Cromwell was offering. He looked at me like I was being irrational, like Michael's well-being was irrelevant compared to his profit margin." The prosecution's cross-examination was harsh, emphasizing that Sarah had committed premeditated murder, that she had acted as judge, jury, and executioner, that no personal circumstances justified taking another human life. But the damage to their case had been done. The jury had seen not a cold-blooded killer, but a desperate mother driven to extremes by a system that valued profit over people, by an employer who treated human beings as disposable assets. In her closing argument, Patricia Thornton made a passionate plea for understanding. "This is not a case of evil," she told the jury. "This is a case of desperation. Sarah Mills is not a murderer by nature. She's a mother who saw her child's life being destroyed by corporate greed and saw no other way to protect him. Was what she did wrong? Yes, absolutely. But before you condemn her, ask yourselves what you would do in her position. Ask yourselves who bears responsibility when profit-driven decisions push ordinary people past the breaking point." The prosecution countered that regardless of motive, murder remained murder, and that allowing emotional circumstances to excuse premeditated killing would undermine the foundations of law and order. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, their verdict was carefully nuanced. They found Sarah Mills guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, accepting the defense argument that she had acted under diminished responsibility due to extreme emotional distress. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the tragic circumstances while emphasizing that the law could not condone vigilante justice. He sentenced Sarah Mills to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving half the sentence. As Sarah was led from the courtroom, she looked toward Michael one final time. Her son watched her go with an expression of bewilderment, unable to fully comprehend why his mother was being taken away. Miss Marple left the courthouse feeling profoundly saddened. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the human cost remained staggering. Michael had lost both his job and his mother. Sarah would spend years in prison for trying to protect her child, and Marcus Hartwell's greed had ultimately cost him his life. There were no winners in this tragedy, only varying degrees of loss. As she travelled back to St. Mary Mead on the afternoon train, Miss Marple reflected that some cases left her with a sense of satisfaction at seeing justice done. This was not one of them. Chapter 10. The Restored Window. 6 months after the trial, on a crisp autumn morning, Miss Marple walked through St. Mary Mead's High Street and paused before Hartwell's department store. The building looked different now, refreshed and welcoming under its new management. Thomas Reed's consortium had successfully purchased the property at auction, and the store had reopened in July as Hartwell's St. Mary Mead, an independent shop owned cooperatively by its employees and village investors. The store windows displayed autumn merchandise with Reed's characteristic artistic flair, but it was the corner window that drew Miss Marple's attention, the space that had once housed the fatal Christmas display. Reed had created something new there, a memorial of sorts that acknowledged the tragedy while celebrating hope and renewal. The new display featured mechanical figures, but simpler ones, less elaborate than the Victorian scene that had preceded them. These figures represented the 4 seasons, rotating monthly to reflect the changing year. Currently, autumn figures gathered harvests and prepared for winter, their movements gentle and unhurried. A small plaque at the window's base read, "In memory of all whose lives were touched by tragedy here, may we learn to value people over profit and community over greed." Miss Marple stood reading the plaque when Thomas Reed emerged from the store, a paintbrush in hand from some interior decorating project. He smiled when he saw her. "Miss Marple, what do you think of our new window?" "It's beautiful," she replied sincerely. "And appropriate. The memorial acknowledges what happened without dwelling in darkness." Reed nodded, his expression somber. "I wanted to create something that honoured everyone affected by last Christmas's events. Not just Marcus Hartwell, but Sarah Mills and her son, all of us who work here, the whole community really. We all suffered from what happened, even those of us who survived it." They stood together, watching the mechanical autumn figures perform their gentle harvest dance. "How is the store doing?" Miss Marple asked. "Better than expected," Reed replied. "We're not making anyone rich, but we're profitable enough to sustain everyone's employment and maintain the building. Dorothy Fletcher is our managing director now, and she's remarkable at community outreach. We've become more than just a shop. We're a gathering place, a village institution. We host events, support local craftspeople, employ people who might struggle to find work elsewhere." "Have you found someone to fill Michael's position?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Reed's expression clouded. "That's been the hardest part. We created a new adapted position similar to what Michael had, and we've employed a young woman with autism who's brilliant at organisation and detail work. But it doesn't change what happened to Michael. Last I heard, he's still with his aunt in Brighton, struggling to adapt. His mother gets supervised visits once a month, but it's not the same as having her in his daily life." Miss Marple sighed. "The consequences of that Christmas Eve continue to ripple outward." "They do," Reed agreed, "but we're trying to create something positive from the tragedy. We've established a fund to support families caring for relatives with disabilities, money set aside each month from our profits. It's small, but it's something. And we've made a commitment that this store will always prioritise people over profit, margins. No one who works here will ever face the kind of desperate circumstances that drove Sarah Mills to murder." Dorothy Fletcher joined them, carrying her coat and handbag, clearly heading out for an errand. She greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Have you heard the latest news? The cooperative model we've implemented here is attracting attention from other small retailers facing competition from chains. We've had 3 inquiries this month from shops in neighbouring towns wanting advice on transitioning to employee ownership. Perhaps something good will come from all this after all." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though the price was terribly high. As Dorothy headed off on her errand, Miss Marple turned back to the window display, watching the mechanical figures in their endless autumn activities. She thought about Sarah Mills, serving her sentence and counting the days until she might be released to reunite with her son. She thought about Michael, struggling in an unfamiliar place, his carefully constructed world shattered by events he couldn't fully understand. And she thought about Marcus Hartwell, whose single-minded pursuit of profit had set in motion a chain of events that destroyed multiple lives, including his own. The Christmas window display that should have been a symbol of joy and community celebration had become instead a cautionary tale about what happened when economic systems failed to value human dignity, when profit margins mattered more than people's lives, when greed superseded compassion. Thomas Reed seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll create a new Christmas display this year," he said quietly. "Something that celebrates community, generosity, and the things that truly matter during the holidays. Not Victorian opulence or mechanical complexity, but simple human warmth." "I think that's wise," Miss Marple replied, "though I suspect many of us will remember last Christmas's display for the rest of our lives, and not for the reasons Marcus Hartwell intended." She walked home slowly, her mind full of reflections on the case. In her experience, murder often revealed the fault lines in human society, the places where pressures built up until someone broke. Sarah Mills had broken under the combined weight of maternal devotion and economic desperation, pushed to violence by a system that treated her son's well-being as expendable. Was she a victim or a villain? Miss Marple believed she was both, simultaneously, a good person who had done a terrible thing under unbearable circumstances. The law had rendered its judgment, and Sarah would serve her time. But Miss Marple suspected history might judge Marcus Hartwell more harshly than it judged his killer. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, she reflected on the patterns that had emerged from this investigation. Like the stitches in her work, human lives were interconnected, each action affecting others, in ways that rippled outward unpredictably. Marcus Hartwell's decision to sell his store for maximum profit had seemed to him a simple business transaction. But that transaction had threatened Dorothy Fletcher's retirement security, Thomas Reed's artistic legacy, Harold Price's business viability, and Michael Mills's carefully constructed world. One of those threads, pulled too tight, had snapped, and the resulting violence had torn the entire fabric. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed into the fire's dancing flames. The Christmas window display murder had taught her, if she needed reminding, that the most dangerous weapons were not always knives or guns, but words and decisions that devalued human worth, that treated people as mere obstacles to profit. Sarah Mills had transformed a symbol of festive joy into an instrument of death. But in many ways, Marcus Hartwell had done the same thing first, by transforming a community institution into a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. As autumn deepened and the village prepared for another Christmas season, Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead would never quite forget what had happened in that sealed window display. The mechanical figures had been dismantled, the Victorian scene erased, but the memory remained, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most peaceful village lay currents of desperation, devotion, and the terrible choices people made when pushed beyond endurance. She picked up her knitting again, her needles clicking in the quiet room. The pattern was complex but not impossible, requiring attention, patience, and an understanding that every stitch mattered. Much like life itself, she reflected, much like the investigation that had revealed how Christmas magic could be corrupted, how maternal love could turn lethal, and how the pursuit of profit could destroy not only businesses and communities, but human souls. The Christmas window display murder was closed now, solved and adjudicated. But its lessons remained, stark and troubling, a reminder that in the delicate balance between profit and people, between greed and compassion, the choice we make defines not only individual fates, but the character of entire communities. Miss Marple hoped that St. Mary Mead, having learned those lessons at such terrible cost, would remember them when future challenges arose. Only time would tell. The end